People like to say I grew up strong, that I became independent early, that I didn't need much help. What they never ask is why I had to. I learned how to stand on my own long before I understood what it meant to be protected. Not because someone prepared me for it, but because no one stayed. When adults say, "She's fine now," sometimes it's not an observation, it's an excuse. The wind still cuts through this dry valley the same way it did back then. And standing here, on the land I was left with, I finally understand what independence really cost. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support truly matters. I remember the day they left because nothing dramatic happened. No shouting, no slam doors, no final argument that could explain everything later. Just 2 suitcases resting by the truck. Dust already settling on the tires. The air dry and heavy, like it had been holding its breath for weeks. My mother checked her phone while my father walked the length of the porch, counting steps without realizing it. He always did that when he wanted to look busy, when he wanted to avoid standing still. They told me it was temporary. Not in those exact words. People rarely use words that can come back to haunt them. Things are complicated right now. This is what makes the most sense. You're strong. You'll be fine. I was old enough to tie my shoes. Old enough to stay quiet when adults talked. Old enough to know that asking questions would only slow things down. That seemed to be enough. My mother bent down to straighten my jacket, even though it wasn't cold. Her hands lingered for a second longer than necessary, like she was trying to memorize the shape of my shoulders. Then she smiled. The kind of smile people use when they want to look certain. "You're already so grown," she said. "You understand." I nodded, because that was the correct response. Because I had learned that understanding was safer than needing. My father hugged me quickly. One arm, a firm pat on the back. He smelled like dust and aftershave and the road he was about to take without me. "We'll call," he said. They always say that part. The truck pulled away slow at first, then faster, tires biting into gravel. The sound stayed long after they disappeared over the ridge. I stood there until the wind filled the space where the engine had been. That was the moment the label settled in. Not abandoned, not left behind, just old enough. People talk about independence like it's a gift, like it's something handed down with care at the right moment, with instructions. But sometimes it's not given, it's assumed. Sometimes it's a quiet decision made by people who are already halfway gone. In psychology, there's a term for this. It's called forced maturity. It happens when a child adapts too quickly, not because they're ready, but because they have to. When being capable becomes a survival skill, the dangerous part isn't the responsibility itself. It's the story adults tell themselves afterward. She didn't cry. She adjusted so well. She didn't even ask us to stay. Those details become proof. Evidence that leaving wasn't harmful. Evidence that the child didn't really need them anymore. What they don't see is what silence costs. Children don't stop needing because they're strong. They stop asking because asking doesn't work. And when a child learns to be quiet, to be useful, to take up less space, adults mistake that for resilience. They call it independence. They call it growth. They call it maturity. Anything but absence. I learned early how to pack my own lunches, how to fix a broken hinge with wire, how to read people's moods before they spoke. Those skills looked impressive from the outside. Inside, they were just ways to stay invisible enough not to be a problem. No one ever said, "We are leaving you." They said, "This is best." They said, "You're doing great." They said, "You don't need us the way you used to." That last one stayed with me because it sounds kind. It sounds respectful. It sounds like trust. But sometimes it's just relief. Relief that responsibility can finally be set down without consequences. Years later, people would tell me how admirable I was, how I handled things on my own, how I never seemed angry. They didn't see the empty rooms at night, or the way I measured my needs before admitting them, or how hard it was to ask for help without apologizing first. Families like mine don't look broken from the outside. There's no violence, no scandal, just distance wrapped in good intentions. That's why so many people recognize it only in hindsight. They'll say, "Nothing bad happened," and they're right. Nothing obvious did. Just a child standing in a dry valley, watching a truck disappear, learning that being okay was the fastest way to be left alone. That lesson sticks. It follows you into adulthood, into relationships, into courtrooms, into moments where people expect you to speak up and explain why something hurt, and you hesitate. Because somewhere along the way, you learned that being low maintenance was safer than being honest. When adults say, "She was fine," what they often mean is, "She didn't make it hard for us to go." And that difference matters more than most people are willing to admit. Because once that label is applied, once a child is declared old enough, it gives everyone else permission to stop looking back. And no one asks what it took for the child to earn it. Walter Caldwell didn't rush into my life like a hero. He was already there. The morning after my parents left, I woke up to the sound of a kettle and the soft creak of old floorboards. The house didn't feel warmer. It just felt occupied, like the air had stopped echoing. I found him in the kitchen, sleeves rolled to his elbows, rinsing a chipped mug with slow, careful movements. He didn't look surprised to see me. He didn't ask if I'd slept. He just nodded toward the chair across from him. "Sit," he said. "One word. No pity." The table was worn smooth in the places hands had rested for decades. A small notebook lay beside his coffee, the kind with a stiff cover and a bent corner, like it had been carried more than it had been stored. He slid a plate toward me. Toast, a little jar of jam, nothing fancy. But it was there, waiting, like it had always been part of the morning. Outside, the valley was already bright. Not beautiful, bright. The kind of light that makes everything look exposed. Walter picked up his notebook, tapped the page once, and said, "We start early." That was how he loved people, not with speeches, with routine. We walked the property before the heat climbed. The ground was cracked in places, dry enough to split under your shoe. Rows of vines stretched toward the horizon, stubborn and quiet. A metal wind chime hung from the porch beam, clicking once every few seconds whenever the breeze shifted. It sounded like a clock that didn't care what day it was. Walter moved slowly, but he never wasted a step. He crouched by the soil, pressed a pinch of dirt between his fingers, and let it fall back down like he was listening to it. "Too dry," he murmured. He didn't say it like a complaint, more like a fact you acknowledge, then work with. He showed me how to check the irrigation line, how to watch the leaves for curling, how to tell when a vine was struggling without looking dramatic about it. He didn't call it a lesson. He just did it in front of me, again and again, until my hands began to copy his without thinking. That first week, nobody asked me how I felt. Not because it didn't matter, because Walter didn't treat feelings like something that needed performance. He treated them like weather, real, changing. But not an excuse to stop showing up. At night, I'd sit on the edge of my bed and wait for the sound of a car in the driveway. Some part of me still expected it. The house was big enough to make silence feel louder. Walter never came into my room and promised anything. He never said, "They'll come back." He never said, "You're safe now," as if safety was a sentence. But every night, I heard his slow steps in the hallway, the pause outside my door, the quiet click of the porch light switching off. And then the wind chime, steady and small, telling me someone was still in the house. There was a kind of comfort in that, not soft, not sweet, solid. In the mornings, he woke me before the sun fully cleared the ridge. "Up," he'd say, tapping the door with 2 knuckles. "The valley doesn't wait." I hated him for it sometimes, not because he was cruel, because sleep felt like the only place where nothing could be asked of me. But he didn't yell when I moved slowly. He didn't punish me for being tired. He just stood there, patient, holding time like it was his responsibility. In the kitchen, he'd spread out paper maps of the property, receipts, weather reports, and a thick binder that smelled like dust and ink. He would point to a line on a forecast. "Read it," he'd say. "Then tell me what it means." At first, my answers were small, childish. "It's going to be hot." Walter would wait a beat. Then he'd ask, "And what does heat do to weak roots?" He never let me stop at the surface. Not because he wanted me to be smart, because he wanted me to be steady. He made me carry a small can when we walked the rows, not because I was useful, but because he wanted my hands to remember responsibility in a simple way. I learned how to fill it, how to pour slowly, how to not waste a drop. He didn't praise me for it. He just nodded when I did it right. That was another way he kept me alive. Walter kept records like some people keep prayers. Every evening, after dinner, he'd sit at the same spot at the table and open that stiff notebook. He'd write down what time we started, how much water the vines got, which section needed trimming, which pipes were leaking, what the wind did around noon. I used to watch the pen move across the page, the ink steady, the handwriting firm. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't emotional, but it was truthful. And in a house where so much had disappeared without warning, truth became its own kind of shelter. Some days, I would catch him looking at the driveway, just for a second, like a reflex he didn't trust. Then he'd go back to his notebook, as if checking the past wouldn't change anything, but recording the present might. Once, when I was older, I asked him why he never talked about them. Walter didn't look up right away. He just turned a page. Then he said, "People who leave don't deserve to be the loudest thing in your head." That was all. No lecture, no bitterness, just one sentence, sharp enough to cut a knot. He didn't protect me by pretending it didn't hurt. He protected me by refusing to let pain become my identity. There were rules in his house, not harsh ones, clear ones. You eat at the table, you finish what you start, you don't lie, especially to yourself, and you don't expect life to be fair, but you act fairly anyway. Walter didn't raise me to win arguments. He raised me to survive consequences. When the drought season came, it was brutal. The vines looked tired. The air felt like it could crack. People in town talked about selling their land, about giving up, about letting go before it got worse. Walter didn't romanticize struggle. He didn't say, "Hard times make you stronger." He just adjusted the plan, cut waste, fixed what could be fixed, let go of what couldn't. And every night, he wrote it down. That's the part people don't understand about steady love. It doesn't announce itself. It repeats, over and over. Until one day you realize you stopped waiting for someone else's return because someone else never left. And slowly, without anyone making a speech about it, you begin to belong. But even then, something stayed unfinished. Because if you were me, you'd know this truth too. A person can stay. A person can raise you. A person can give you structure and food and safety, but they can't erase the fact that someone else chose to go. And when people who go eventually come back, they don't come back for love. They come back for the story. They come back for what they think they're still owed. And I didn't know it yet. But Walter's notebook wasn't just a habit, it was preparation. Walter died on a Tuesday, the kind of day the valley looked the same as always: dry air, pale sky, vines sitting quiet in the heat, like the world didn't notice one good man had stopped breathing. I noticed because the house went still in a different way. Not the lonely kind from childhood, a heavier kind, like the walls had lost their spine. After the funeral, people came by with casseroles and awkward hugs. They told me he lived a long life. They told me I was lucky to have him. They told me he'd want me to be strong. Then they went home. I stayed. The first night, I sat at the kitchen table where he used to write. The stiff notebook was still there, exactly where he left it. His pen, capped. A faint ring from his coffee mug darkening the wood. I didn't touch anything. I just listened to the wind chime on the porch and tried to learn what silence sounded like when it meant final. 2 mornings later, I heard tires on gravel. It wasn't the slow, familiar sound of neighbors pulling up to drop off food. It was confident, quick, like whoever was driving already knew they belonged. I stepped onto the porch and shaded my eyes. A black SUV rolled up the driveway, glossy and clean in a place where dust usually won. It parked near the porch steps like it owned the space. The engine cut off. The air held. Then the doors opened. My mother came out first. Her hair was perfect. Her sunglasses hid her eyes. She looked like someone who had spent years practicing how to be seen. My father followed, adjusting his watch as he walked, like time was something he controlled. They didn't hesitate. They didn't pause at the porch. They didn't look around for Walter. They climbed the steps and stood in front of me like we'd spoken yesterday. My mother smiled, not warmly, not cruelly, professionally, like she was stepping into a camera frame. "Lena," she said, drawing out my name as if tasting whether it still belonged to her. "I'm so sorry about your grandfather." My father nodded once. He was a complicated man. He said, "That was their grief." A polite sentence and a controlled face. Then my mother's gaze moved past me, into the house, toward the hallway, toward the rooms Walter had filled with quiet discipline and steady presence. "Are you holding up?" she asked. It sounded like concern, but the question didn't reach her eyes. I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't have words, because I was measuring the moment, the way I always had. I was checking for consequences. My father glanced at the vines, the land, the barns, the old equipment. His eyes moved like he was taking inventory. "It's a lot for one person," he said finally, "especially someone your age." There it was, The first crack. Not a question about where I'd been all these years. Not a quiet apology. Not even a, we should have come sooner. Just an assumption that I couldn't handle what Walter built, which would make their presence feel reasonable. My mother stepped closer, lowering her voice like we were sharing something intimate. "We've been talking," she said. "And we think it's important we sit down and discuss the estate. Properly. The estate. Not Walter. Not us. The estate. If you've ever been on the receiving end of that word in a family, you know what it does. It turns grief into paperwork, love into numbers, a lifetime into a list." I watched them speak and realized something that made my stomach go cold. They weren't nervous. They weren't ashamed. They were prepared. My father had a folder tucked under his arm, crisp edges, fresh printouts, tabs. He held it like a shield. My mother's purse was structured and expensive, the kind that sits upright on its own. Inside it, I later realized, was a business card for a lawyer in the county seat. They hadn't come to mourn. They'd come to claim. And the strangest part wasn't that they wanted something. It was that they seemed genuinely convinced they deserved it. That's the thing people don't understand about abandonment. The ones who leave don't always carry guilt the way you think they should. Most of the time, they rewrite the story until they can live with themselves. They don't say, "We left our child." They say, "We did what we had to do." They don't say, "We chose freedom." They say, "We chose stability." They don't say, "We were selfish." They say, "We were trying our best." And if they repeat that version long enough, it stops feeling like a lie. It becomes their truth. My father looked at me like I was a stranger who owed him respect. "I know it's been a long time," he said, as if distance was something that simply happened, like weather. "But none of this changes the fact that we're family." Family. That word landed like a stone, because it was the same word that had been used to excuse everything. Family means forgiveness. Family means you don't ask too many questions. Family means you don't make people uncomfortable with what they did. I could feel the anger rise, sharp and quick, and I swallowed it the way I always had. Walter taught me that anger is easy. Consequences are harder. My mother reached out like she was going to touch my arm, then stopped just short, hovering, a performance of closeness without the risk of it. "We've watched you," she said softly, "from a distance. We knew you were doing well." That was the part that almost made me laugh, because from a distance sounded so gentle, so reasonable, like they were being respectful, but it was just absence with better packaging. My father opened his folder slightly, as if the paper itself carried authority. "Your grandfather's assets are significant," he said, "and there are considerations, legal considerations." He said it with the calm confidence of someone who had already rehearsed the outcome, like the ending belonged to him. And that's when I understood the real reason they were here. Money was part of it. But it wasn't the whole thing. What they wanted most was permission, a signature from the world that told them they hadn't failed. Because if they could take something from Walter Land, control, a portion of what he built, it would quietly rewrite the past. It would imply they were still important, still central, still entitled. It would say, without anyone having to speak it out loud, maybe what they did wasn't that bad. Maybe leaving me wasn't abandonment. Maybe it was just a decision, and maybe I was fine. That's why they walked onto the porch with straight backs and steady voices. They weren't coming to beg. They were coming to restore their image, to themselves, to the town, and to anyone watching. My mother smiled again, the same polished expression, and said, "We should handle this the right way, with respect, with dignity, dignity." The irony sat between us like heat, because dignity is what you offer someone when you've already decided they won't fight back. I looked at the dusty valley stretching behind them, the vines Walter had tended through drought and wind, the porch where I learned what staying looked like, and I realized something else. People who truly care don't need a court to prove it. People who stayed don't need paperwork to be remembered. Only the ones who left do. Only the ones who disappeared come back demanding a document that says they still matter. My father closed his folder with a soft click. "We'll give you a few days," he said, generous in a way that wasn't generosity at all. "But we need to move quickly," as if Walter's death was a deadline, as if grief was an inconvenience. They turned to leave, already certain the next step would go their way, and I stood on the porch, watching their SUV swallow the driveway dust, and I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. If they're this confident now, what do they think they can take from me next? The courthouse sat at the edge of town like something everyone forgot was still there. Faded steps. A heavy wooden door with scratches near the handle. Old flags out front that snapped in the wind like they were tired of being loyal. I'd driven past it 100 times and never once imagined I'd walk inside carrying my entire life in my chest. That morning, the sky was a hard, pale blue, the kind that makes you squint even in the shade. The valley wind was up, pushing dust across the parking lot in thin, nervous lines. I parked beside a row of trucks and a single black sedan that didn't belong here. My mother's. I could tell by the shine. I sat in my car for a moment longer than I needed to, hands still on the wheel, listening to my own breath. The only sound outside was the wind and the faint creak of the courthouse flagpole. Then I got out. The steps were uneven. The air smelled like sun-baked wood and old paper. When I reached for the door, the metal handle was warm, as if the building had been holding heat for decades. Inside, the hallway was narrow and dim. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A bulletin board on the wall held flyers for lost dogs, town meetings, and a notice about water restrictions. Life went on. Even when yours was about to be put on trial, I could hear voices before I saw the courtroom. Low murmurs, quick laughter, the shuffle of shoes on tile. When I stepped through the doorway, I saw them. My parents were already seated near the front, turned slightly toward each other like they were sharing a private joke. My mother's hair was immaculate. My father wore a suit that looked out of place in a room filled with denim jackets and worn boots. They didn't look worried. They looked ready. To my left, a row of people I recognized from town sat together, members of the local council, a couple of investors who'd been sniffing around Walter's land for years, and one man I didn't know but could immediately tell was there for influence, not justice. His watch was too expensive. His smile was too practiced. I felt it then, sharp and quiet. This wasn't just family business anymore. This was public. They weren't only trying to take what Walter left behind. They were trying to take the story. Because in a small town, facts matter less than what people repeat. And if enough people repeat something confidently, it starts to sound like truth. My mother spotted me and smiled. That same polished expression. The one that said, "We're still the adults here." My father didn't smile. He just watched me like he was studying whether I'd learned my place. I walked to the table on the other side with my attorney, Thomas Reed. Thomas didn't offer comfort. He offered structure. He set his briefcase down, opened it, and began arranging papers in neat stacks like he was building a wall. "Remember," he said quietly, without looking at me, "they want you emotional. Stay clear." I nodded. My throat felt tight, but my hands stayed steady. That was the only kind of strength I'd ever been allowed. The judge entered a moment later. Judge Everett Hale. He looked like the kind of man who didn't waste words. Gray hair, calm face, a posture that made the room quiet without asking for it. Everyone stood, then sat. The gavel hit once, firm but not dramatic. And just like that, my life became a case number. My mother's attorney began first. He spoke smoothly, like he'd done this 1,000 times in bigger cities with brighter courtrooms. He called Walter the decedent, as if saying his name would make the room messy. He referred to me as the beneficiary, as if I was a line item. He talked about family rights and reasonable expectations. Then he did something I didn't expect. He painted them as victims. He said they were shut out. He said they were misled. He said they were robbed of their rightful role, not as parents, as heirs. He described Walter as controlling, stubborn, unforgiving. He described me as young, impressionable, possibly manipulated. I watched the jurors' eyes move between us. I watched the people in town lean forward, hungry for a version of the story that made sense to them, and I understood the real danger. It wasn't losing land. It was losing the right to be believed. Because if the room accepted their version, then everything I lived through would be rewritten. The abandonment would become a misunderstanding. The years of silence would become distance. Walter's presence would become interference. And my survival would become evidence against me. Look how fine she turned out. Look how capable she is. She didn't need them. That lie again. Dressed up in legal language. My father took the stand. He spoke with calm conviction, like he was explaining a decision any reasonable person would understand. He talked about pressure, work, travel, obligations. He said he'd always intended to reconnect. He said life just moved fast. He said Walter made it difficult. When the attorney asked him why he hadn't visited, he shrugged slightly. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it carried a message. I did what I could. The rest wasn't my fault. My mother followed. She dabbed at the corner of her eye once, perfectly timed, like she'd practiced the motion in the mirror. She spoke about love like it was a concept, not a memory. She said she worried about me every day. She said she prayed for me. She said she assumed Walter would do the right thing and keep them informed. Not one of them said, "I'm sorry." Not once. Because they weren't there to repair. They were there to reclaim. As the testimony went on, I kept catching glimpses of the council members whispering to each other, the investors passing notes, the man with the expensive watch leaning back with quiet confidence, like the outcome was already decided. I realized then that the stakes were larger than my family. Walter's land wasn't just sentimental, it was valuable. And in places like this, value attracts people who believe they're entitled to shape reality. They weren't just taking a vineyard. They were taking a legacy. They were taking the right to say who Walter was, who I was, what happened. Thomas finally stood when it was our turn. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform. He simply looked at the judge and said, "This case isn't about what they feel they deserve. It's about what they did and what they didn't do for 20 years. He let that sit. And for the first time, the room felt uncomfortable, because did and didn't are hard to argue with. My parents' confidence didn't crack yet, but I saw it shift, just slightly, like a polished surface catching a new light. I sat there, hearing my heart beat, watching the dust drift in the thin sunbeam that cut across the courtroom floor. And I thought about Walter at the kitchen table, writing in that stiff notebook every night. Back then, it seemed like habit. Now, it felt like something else, like preparation. Because in a room like this, feelings don't win, stories do, and whoever controls the story controls the outcome. If you were me, what would you be more afraid of right now, losing the land or losing the truth? Right then, sitting in that worn courtroom, I realized something that felt almost cruel. If Walter hadn't written anything down, I might have already been losing, not because I was lying, not because they were telling the truth, but because the world doesn't reward pain unless it can be proven. Let me pause the story for a second and ask you something. If you were sitting in that room and all you had were two versions of the past, who would you believe, a daughter saying, "They left me with nothing but a shaky breath and an old memory," or two polished adults saying, "We did our best," with a lawyer, a folder, and a story that sounds clean? That's the part no one prepares you for. In real life, truth doesn't walk into a courtroom and announce itself. Truth has to be carried in. And if it's only carried in your chest, if it's only carried in emotion, it's easy for someone else to call it unstable, exaggerated, confused. My parents' attorney kept using words like miscommunication and family tension. He said, "There were complicated circumstances," he said. "They believed the child was being cared for," he said. "The decedent encouraged distance, as if 20 years of silence was a misunderstanding, not a choice." And here's the thing about human memory, especially childhood memory. It's real, but it's vulnerable. Not because it's false, because it's personal. It's made of smells and sounds and moments that don't come with timestamps. The dust on the driveway, the way my mother's hand hovered and didn't touch me, the quick hug that felt like a transaction. Try proving that. Try holding that up to a jury as evidence. This is why so many people lose their own stories in adulthood. Not because they forgot what happened, but because someone with more confidence tells a different version louder. And if you're the one who was hurt, you start questioning yourself. Was it really that bad? Am I overreacting? Maybe they meant well. That's how people who abandon you keep you quiet long after they're gone. They don't just leave. They leave you with doubt. In that courtroom, doubt was exactly what they were selling. They didn't need to prove they were good parents. They only needed to make the room unsure that they were bad ones, because uncertainty buys sympathy, and sympathy opens doors. My father sat there with his hands folded like a man who deserved respect. My mother held her posture like grief had made her fragile. They weren't acting like people who feared consequences. They were acting like people who expected understanding. And the town was watching. Not just because Walter was known, because land in a small place isn't just land. It's power. It's identity. It's something people build fantasies around. I could feel it in the way the council members leaned in the way investors whispered, in the way that man with the expensive watch didn't look at me once he looked at the judge. like he was already negotiating in his head. Here's what I learned about adult games. They're rarely about who's right. They're about who can make their version feel safer for everyone else to accept. It's easier for people to believe parents didn't mean harm. It's easier to believe a child turned out fine. It's easier to believe Walter was just stubborn, just controlling, just old-fashioned. Because then no one has to confront the uglier truth that people can leave their own child behind and still sleep at night. And if you've ever been that child, you know how that feels. You spend years building yourself up on scraps of consistency. You learn to function. You learn to smile. You learn to be fine. And then one day, when the people who left come back, they point at the person you became and say, "See, we didn't ruin you," as if survival is proof of care, as if your strength belongs to them. Now imagine if Walter hadn't kept that notebook. Imagine if there were no records of the day-to-day, no notes about repairs he made because no one else would, no lists of school fees and doctor appointments, no handwriting that showed his mind was clear and steady, no proof that he was present, no proof that they were absent. All I would have had was my voice. And in a courtroom, a voice can be dismissed. A voice can be called emotional. A voice can be painted as manipulation. That's why forced independence is such a trap. It teaches you to endure quietly, but quiet endurance doesn't translate well into legal language. It translates into assumptions. She didn't need them. She managed. She was fine. So why punish the parents now? That question hangs in the air in places like this. Not because it's fair, because it's convenient. Thomas leaned toward me and whispered, "They're building a narrative. We're going to have to break it with facts. Facts, not feelings." I stared at the wooden rail in front of me, seeing the small scratches carved into it by people who came here before me. People who thought justice would feel cleaner than it does. And I thought about Walter at the kitchen table, writing every night like it mattered. Back then, I assumed it was just the kind of man he was. Methodical, disciplined, thorough. In that moment, I understood it differently. He wasn't writing for himself. He was writing for the day someone would try to rewrite the truth, because in conflicts like this, love doesn't win by being real. Love wins by being recorded. So let me ask you again, if there were no notebook, no records, no paper trail, in that courtroom, who would have been believed? The shift didn't come with shouting, it came with paper. Thomas stood up slowly, the way people do when they know the room is about to change. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. He simply carried a box to the table, cardboard, worn at the edges. It looked ordinary. That was the point. The judge glanced down. My parents didn't move. Not yet. These, Thomas said, are the personal records of Walter Caldwell. Not memories, not impressions, records. The box opened with a dull sound, and suddenly the courtroom felt smaller. Inside were notebooks, dozens of them. Some thick, some thin, all labeled in the same handwriting. Dates, weather, repairs, expenses, my name, written over and over again. Not like a headline, but like a responsibility. The first notebook was passed to the clerk, then another, then another. The sound of pages turning replaced the whispers. My mother leaned forward for the first time. My father crossed his arms, still confident, still composed. That confidence lasted until the entries were read out loud. March 12th. Fixed irrigation line near the south fence. Emma stayed home from school. Fever. June 3rd. Paid enrollment deposit. Orientation next week. October 19th. Storm damage to roof. Emma helped. Learned fast. No emotion, no commentary, just facts. Stacked on top of each other, year after year. This is what responsibility looks like when no one is watching. Not speeches, not apologies, consistency. The judge adjusted his glasses. He didn't ask how Walter felt. He asked how often, how long, how much. Evidence has weight, and with every page, that weight shifted. My parents' lawyer stood up quickly, objecting to something about relevance, about interpretation. The judge waved him down. These are contemporaneous records, he said. They speak for themselves. And that was the moment I saw it. The exact second when the room stopped wondering who was telling the truth. Because evidence doesn't argue, it doesn't persuade, it just exists. Then came the letters. Thomas hesitated before pulling them out, like he knew they carried something heavier than numbers. These were found inside the notebooks, he said. Unsent. The first letter was addressed to me. The second wasn't. The second letter was addressed to my father. The judge's brow tightened. Thomas read, Charles, I won't force you to be present, but don't confuse absence with necessity. She notices more than you think. Silence. Real silence. Not the polite kind. The kind that settles. My father shifted in his seat, just slightly. The second letter continued, If you ever come back, understand this. Love is not retroactive. You don't earn it later. My mother's hand went to her mouth, not because she was shocked, because she recognized herself in what wasn't there. No replies, no visits, no counter letters. The record was complete, and suddenly, their story had nowhere to stand. This is the part people misunderstand about justice. They think it looks like forgiveness. It doesn't. It looks like consequence. The judge didn't scold my parents. He didn't shame them. He didn't ask why, because why doesn't matter when responsibility is missing. He asked one question. Can either party refute the consistency of these records? No one spoke. Not because they didn't want to, because they couldn't. That's the thing about evidence. It doesn't leave room for rewriting. You can spin intentions. You can soften language. You can explain motives. But you can't erase years of showing up. You can't out-argue ink. My parents' confidence didn't collapse in one dramatic moment. It thinned, like air leaking from a sealed room. Their shoulders lowered. Their lawyer stopped interrupting. The room understood. Responsibility had entered. And it wasn't asking for an apology. It was asking for an outcome. This wasn't about punishment. It was about ownership. Who owned the work? Who owned the nights? Who owned the choices? For the first time since they walked back into my life, my parents were facing something they couldn't charm, explain, or delay. A ledger. That's what made it unbearable and satisfying. Because moral satisfaction doesn't come from watching someone suffer. It comes from watching reality finally catch up. I didn't look at them when the judge finished reviewing the documents. I looked at the notebooks, at the worn corners, at the coffee stains, at the margins where Walter had written reminders to himself, because that's what love looked like in his hands. Prepared, accountable, quiet. And in that moment, I understood something that felt steady, not triumphant, Responsibility doesn't need to be announced. It waits. And when it arrives, there's nowhere left to hide. The judge didn't raise his voice when he spoke. He didn't look at anyone in particular. He looked down at the papers one last time, then set them aside, like a man putting away something that no longer needed to be examined. His ruling came calmly, clearly, almost quietly. The estate would remain where it was. The records established care, presence, responsibility. The challenge was denied. There was no gasp, no outburst, just a soft shift in the room, like everyone exhaled at the same time. I felt Thomas's hand brush my arm, not a squeeze, just contact, a signal that it was over. I didn't smile, not because I wasn't relieved, but because nothing about this felt like winning. My parents didn't look at me. They gathered their things with practiced movements, the kind people make when they've spent years appearing composed. My mother adjusted her jacket. My father nodded once, to no one. They left without saying my name. And I realized something then that surprised me. I didn't need them to say anything. The truth had already spoken. People imagine justice as a moment, a slam of a gavel, a sentence, a dramatic turn, but that's not what it feels like when you're inside it. Justice feels like weightlifting, not excitement, relief, like finally setting down something you've been carrying for years without realizing how heavy it was. I stood when the clerk told us we could leave. My legs felt steady. My hands didn't shake. That was new. Outside the courtroom, the sunlight hit differently than it had that morning. The same building, the same steps. But the air felt less tight. Someone from the council walked past me and nodded, polite but distant, like the story had already started rewriting itself in his head. I didn't stay to listen. I didn't wait for congratulations. I walked down the steps alone. If you were expecting this part to feel triumphant, it didn't. Because the truth doesn't choose winners. It chooses who can stand when everything is stripped away. And standing doesn't look impressive. It looks quiet. I thought about Walter then, not the man the courtroom saw through his notebooks, but the man who stood at the sink every night, rinsing dirt from his hands. The man who fixed fences no one noticed. The man who never once told me he was sacrificing anything. He didn't raise me to defeat anyone. He raised me to endure without lying to myself. That's the difference. Winning is loud. Endurance is silent. When people asked me later how it felt, I didn't know how to answer. How do you explain that the thing you thought you wanted recognition, validation, acknowledgement didn't matter as much as you expected? How do you say that what mattered was knowing, without doubt, that your life wasn't an accident, that the years you survived weren't empty, that someone chose you daily, even when no one was watching? I didn't walk out of that courtroom feeling taller. I walked out feeling grounded. And that's when I understood something that had taken me a lifetime to learn. The truth doesn't rush, it doesn't perform, it doesn't chase approval, it waits. And if you've lived honestly long enough, it eventually finds you standing where you are, not celebrated, not applauded, just still there. And that's enough. Because standing means you didn't disappear to make others comfortable. Standing means you didn't rewrite yourself to fit someone else's version. Standing means you carried your story without distortion. The judge didn't give me my life back that day. I already had it. What he did was remove the last doubt that it was ever mine to begin with. So when I walked away, I didn't look back. Not because I was angry, But because the truth doesn't need witnesses once it's been seen, it just keeps going, and so did I. The will was clear. Everyone kept saying that, as if clarity was the point. Clear language, clear instructions, clear outcomes. But standing alone in the farmhouse a few days later, I realized the will hadn't explained the most important thing at all. It told me what I owned. It didn't tell me what I'd been given. The house was quiet in the way it always had been after sunset. No television, no music, just the hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of wood cooling after a long day. I walked through the room slowly, touching nothing at first, like I was afraid of disturbing something that had already settled. Walter's boots were still by the door. Cleaned, laced, waiting. He hadn't written that into any document. He never needed to. I opened the kitchen drawer where he kept his tools, not expensive ones, just the ones that worked. A pencil, worn flat on one side, a small notebook, the same one he carried in his back pocket. That was when it finally landed. The inheritance everyone fought over wasn't the land. It wasn't the money. It wasn't even the house. It was the way he taught me to move through the world without cutting corners. Walter never told me to be strong. He showed me what strength looked like when no one was applauding. He woke up early. He finished what he started. He didn't explain himself to people who hadn't earned the explanation. And when he made mistakes, he corrected them quietly. That was the legacy, not power, direction, a compass. I thought about my parents then, not with anger, with distance. They hadn't lost something that day in court. They'd revealed something. They had come looking for ownership. Walter had left stewardship. Those two things look similar from far away. Up close, they couldn't be more different. I didn't feel the urge to call them, not to explain, not to accuse, not to ask anything. That surprised me. For most of my life, I thought healing would come from confrontation, from finally being heard, from watching them understand what they had done. But understanding isn't something you can force on someone who's avoided it for decades. And I didn't need their awareness to move forward anymore. I walked outside as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the fields. Walter used to stand there every evening, checking the soil with his boot. No ceremony, just habit. I stepped into the same place. The ground was firm, dry, still alive. I realized then that I wasn't carrying bitterness the way I once feared I would, because bitterness comes from waiting for people to change. Waiting for apologies, waiting for recognition. Walter never waited. He acted. That's what he passed on. I didn't become softer by forgiving. I became steadier by letting go of the need to be seen as the wounded one. I wasn't a child standing at a gate anymore. I was an adult who knew exactly where she stood. And that changed everything. People talk about closure like it's an ending. It isn't. It's a beginning without noise. No announcement. No dramatic shift. Just the quiet confidence that you don't need to prove your pain to justify your life. I didn't destroy my parents. I didn't erase them. I didn't win anything over them. I simply stopped arranging my life around their absence. That was the final inheritance, the freedom to move forward without dragging the past behind me like evidence. Walter didn't raise me to punish anyone. He raised me to live in a way that wouldn't require punishment to feel complete. That's the part no document can capture, not the assets. The orientation. When I locked the door that night, I didn't feel like I was protecting something fragile. I felt like I was carrying something durable, something tested, something earned. And if you're listening to this wondering what you've inherited from the people who stayed or the ones who didn't, here's what I learned too late, but will carry forever. The most powerful legacy isn't what you receive, it's what you refuse to abandon. Your integrity, your consistency, your sense of right and wrong when no one is watching. That's not written into a will. It's written into how you live the next day and the day after that. And every quiet decision no one applauds. That's what stays. Long after the papers are filed, long after the room empties, long after the noise fades. That's the inheritance that never runs out. If this story hit you in a place you don't usually talk about, I want you to hear me clearly. You're not too sensitive. You're not stuck in the past. And you're not wrong for feeling the weight of something that never left a bruise on your skin. Some families don't scream. They don't hit. They don't break things in front of the neighbors. They just disappear in small ways. A missed pickup, a silence after a hard day, a "you're fine" said too quickly, a "you're so independent" said like a compliment, when really it's a shortcut. And if you grew up under that kind of quiet absence, you probably learned how to function before you learned how to feel. You learned how to smile at school. You learned how to handle your own problems. You learned how to not ask for much, because asking felt like begging, and begging felt humiliating, so you carried it, and you became strong. But here's the question I want to leave you with. What label did someone put on you that you never chose? Too mature, too capable, doesn't need anyone, the easy child, the one who can handle it. Sometimes those labels aren't about you at all. Sometimes they're just the language adults use when they're backing away from responsibility. And the hardest part is this: you can grow up. You can succeed. You can build a life. And people will point at your survival like it's proof they didn't fail you. But survival is not evidence of love. Survival is evidence of will. If you're watching this and you've spent years trying to convince yourself it wasn't that bad, I'm not here to make you angry. I'm here to make you honest. Because honesty is where healing starts. Not in revenge, not in proving someone wrong, but in finally admitting I deserved more than I got. And if no one ever told you that, let this be the moment you hear it. You deserved someone who stayed. You deserved someone who showed up without needing to be asked. You deserved care that didn't come with conditions, and if you didn't get that, it was not because you were unworthy. It was because someone else was unwilling. That's a different kind of truth, and it changes how you carry your story. For me, the courtroom wasn't the victory. The victory was walking out without needing their approval, without needing them to understand, without needing to be seen as the abandoned child anymore. Maybe your version of that looks different. Maybe it's setting a boundary you've been avoiding. Maybe it's stopping the apology tour. Maybe it's telling yourself, quietly, I'm allowed to stop explaining, and if you're still waiting for a perfect apology, I won't lie to you. Some people never give it. Not because they don't remember, because admitting the truth would change who they think they are, so you can spend your life waiting. Or you can build your life anyway. That's not bitterness. That's maturity that actually belongs to you. So if this story felt familiar, don't scroll past it like it's nothing. Sit with it for a second. Ask yourself what you've been carrying that was never yours to carry. And if you know someone who grew up in that kind of quiet house, someone who learned to be fine too early, Share this with them, not to reopen wounds, but to name what was never named. And if you want more stories like this, stories that don't just entertain you, but give you language for the things you've lived through, go ahead and like this video. Subscribe to the channel and stay with me. Because some truths don't set you free in one moment. They set you free one honest sentence at a time.